They said no woman could cross the Red Valley alone, not in summer, not in boots worn thin as eggshells, not when the sun burned down like God's own wrath, but she did somehow. She had no wagon, no husband, no horse, just a canvas sack, a rusted tin cup, and a little green book, tied shut with twine, and lungs full of stubborn breather. Name was Abigail. She used to be someone's wife, used to live near the river, where white fences lined the wheat like a hymn, but now all that was ash behind her. She walked 17 miles, without water, face peeling under the sun, boots splitting at the seams. Still she kept moving, because she didn't want to die near anything that ever reminded her of him that morning. The wind was hot enough to make the lizards dig down into the dirt, the kind of heat that makes men hallucinate, but Abigail wasn't seeing things. She was letting go of Them's memory of his fists, the smell of bourbon and sweat, the last words he said before he rode off and left her with nothing but bruises and a broken compassion. Said, a woman like you was never meant for the West. She slept that night in the curve of a dried creek bed, back pressed to a fallen cottonwood, skin scratched with sage thorns. A rattlesnake watched her once, then slithered away. She had nothing worth biting any more. Far above, hidden by branches that hadn't bloomed in decades, a shadow moved, careful as a mountain lion, still as the rocks. Man who watched her was not pale, broken, not affrighted. He was Apache, tall beyond measure, hair thick and braided, dark as crow feathers, his chest bare, marked with old scars that told stories no white man ever heard. A long knife at his hip and something older than fire in his eyes. She did not come close. He just sat on his haunches, silent, watching the settler woman sleep. Next morning, Abigail woke with cracked lips and sand in her eyes, her mouth too dry to form a prayer. She reached for the tin cup and found it full with whiskey, not with filthy creek water, but clean spring water, cold, fresh, left in a carved wooden bowl. She blinked at it like it might disappear, touched it, smelled it, drank it in 3 gulps, then stared into the trees. No one there, just heat and wind and the soft cry of hawks that night. She whispered to the dark, if you're a ghost, thank you. The second day, she found smoked meat near her bedroll, wrapped in birch bark beside it, a small flint stone and dried grass, away to make fire, away to stay alive again. No one in sight, but she felt him, not like a danger, not like him, not like the preacher's son who lied with holy hands, or the lawman who said you must have deserved it. Miss, this was different. This presence didn't shrink her, didn't ask her name, didn't ask for anything. It just kept her breathing. She spoke again that night, this time to the stars. Why are you helping me? Somewhere in the brush above he listened, stone-faced, one palm pressed to the ground, feeling the pulse of the earth and hers. In the third day, she stewed it, nearly broke her legs to do it, but she died, and she followed the trail of smoke, barely visible, like a thread through the trees. Found a fire, and beside it a man, biggest man she'd ever seen, bronze like the land itself, face painted faintly with clay, a necklace of eagle bone resting on his chest. He did not rise, he did not speak, just placed a slab of meat on a hot stone, tore some bread with thick fingers, and pushed it toward her with the same care a man might hand over a sleeping child. Then one word, low, rough, spoken like gravel in the wind, come Sacheti. She didn't cry, not even when her belly clenched from eating to fast, not even when he handed her water from his own gourd, not even when she looked up and saw in his face something that shattered her. Kindness without condition, did not ask who she was, did not ask what she'd run from, did not ask what the bruises on her arms meant, or why her left hand shook when he reached for the firewood. Just sat beside her, not touching, not staring, not demanding. Us there, a mountain beside her, broken bones. That night she lay near his fire, not beside him, but close enough to feel safe for the first time in years. And she whispered, not to the stars this time, but to Hyman, though she wasn't sure he'd answer, you're the first man who didn't try to own me. The fire cracked softly in reply, and from behind his long hair she heard a word, risen it loud, not eager, just truth. Sleepin'. She didn't with fear, not with one eye open, but like a child as the wind softened, and coyotes sang far. Fan the man who had no name in her story, yet sat wide awake, watching the darkness, guarding something delicate, as if it were sacred. The desert has its own language, it speaks in hushes, in coyote prints, and drifting ash and wind, that kisses your cheek, then vanishes like it never knew your name. Abigail learned to listen it, because she wanted to, but because silence was safer then. Prayer be the fourth morning she no longer woke with dread. Her body still ached, but not in that desperate way it did before, not like it had to fight for every breath, no. She woke to the smell of wood smoke, soft, comforting, and something that reminded her of home before home became a place to escape. Heathgen Apache man still said little, only what needed saying to it. Fire with his voice was gravel wrapped in slow thunder, but it never struck her, never scolded, never snared. Each word felt earned, not wasted that day. He handed her a bundle wrapped in rabbit hide. Inside were herbs, pine resin, lavender, sage, enough to make a healing salve for the welts on her arm. She looked up at him, eyes wide, but he didn't meet her gaze, just placed the bundle by her sleeping mat and turned to split wood. Not once did he ask how the bruises came to Beth. It, she realized, was the kindest thing he could have done around the fire. She began to hum softly, just pieces of old songs her mother used to sing. She didn't remember the lyrics, only that tonight was the first music that Land had heard in years, and though he never said so, she saw the Apache's fingers pause once while sharpening his knife, as if he was listening that evening. As the sun bled into the red cliffs, he gestured for her to follow. They walked through dry grass, past snake tracks, to a high stone ledge that overlooked the valley, pointed out over the horizon beyond the shadows, and spoke again. Water for hills west. She nodded, felt it in her ribs that he was teaching her, not leading her. There was no rope binding her wrist, no fence around his camp, no rules but the ones made of silence and respect. She could leave, but she stayed at it because of fear, but because of peace. Later that night she broke her own silence, sitting near the fire, her knees hugged close. She whispered, "My name is Abigail." He didn't look up from the deer hide he was working, didn't smile, didn't nod, just said to Hono. She didn't know the meaning, didn't ask, but she repeated it in her head like a prayer she hadn't been allowed to say in years. She offered her a blanket that night made from buffalo hide. It smelled of cedar, and when she pulled it close, she dreamed of rain days. Became a rhythm, morning fire, food shared without words, nods instead of sentences, learning to fish from canyon pools using wild onions and river mint. Every task was slow, deliberate, sacred. It was a life she never imagined wanting, that each quiet hour healed something loud inside her. In the sixth day she found a small carving left near her sleeping mat, a figure, her shape unmistakable, carved into stone, with long hair and a soft line down the spine next to it. A second figure, broad, solid, but not touching her, just beside. She held it like it might vanish, then pressed it to her chest. That same afternoon, two horses appeared on the edge of the canyon, distant, watching. Tohono saw them before she did. His body tensed, not with fear, but with memory. Stood quietly, placed his bow across his back, then vanished into the trees without a word. Abigail watched from behind a rock, and for the first time she felt a fear, not for herself, but for him. Over those men were, they didn't come for her, they came for the man who had offered her nothing but let shelter. Be dusk. He returned, no blood, no words, just smoke rising again from the fire, and a rabbit on the spit, fresh caught, skinned clean. Sat, broke off a piece, handed it to her, then finally met her eyes, and for the first time she saw the storm behind them, not rage, not cruelty, but history. And a chest. She asked nothing, only reached forward and placed her palm gently against the back of his hand. Didn't pull away, didn't stiffen, just let it happen like rain on stone. Later she wrote in her journal, "This is the first place I have ever felt untouched by shame. This is the first man who lets me speak only when I want to. This is not safety out of weakness, but strength so great it need not roar." She didn't know who those writers were, didn't know what they'd seen or if they'd return, but she knew this: she would rather face death beside the one who asked for nothing than live under the roof of the one who took everything. That night, under the wide western sky, he sat across from her, moonlight on his face, firelight in his eyes. And finally she asked, "Why did you help me?" He thought for a long time, then said, "Because you didn't scream." And she smiled for the first time in a long, long while. Somewhere between the 13th sunrise and the 14th, they began to speak in full sentences, not many, just enough to let the soul show its hand. She was carving a new bowstring, and she was grinding pine ash into poultice paste. The fire crackled between them, neither looking directly at the other. "Runtle," she said softly, "what does your name mean?" Tohono looked at the flames, then at the canyon wall. "Man from the burning land." She nodded. "That fits." He didn't ask about her name, or what it had meant back when she wore corsets, and held a hymn book, and braided her hair for someone who never looked her in the eyes. But later, as they watched the stars drip across the black sky, she whispered it anyway. Abigail means joy of the Father. She chuckled. I suppose I was poorly named. Tohono turned slightly toward her. Names change like riverbeds. She smiled at that, let the silence stretch, then said, what name would you give me? He paused, then spoke low, sits with storms. The next few days passed like wind over wheat, soft, quiet, unassuming, but everything was changing. Schlaft now, not loudly, not the way barmaids did in saloons, but the kind of laugh that came from below the ribs, like it had been locked in a trunk for years, and someone had finally found the key. Tohono didn't laugh much, but when she dropped a pot into the creek by accident and gasped like a child, he let out a quiet, surprised sound, almost a laugh, almost marked it like a sun rising. The evenings she read from her journal aloud, just the good parts, descriptions of sky, of stone, of a man who said little, but carried truth like a second spin. Any night she wrote this: he does not chase me. He does not fix me. He builds fires and lets me sit beside them until I remember how to warm myself. That night he brought her something, a comb made of polished bone, hand-carved. She held it like it might shatter, and when she looked up he gestured for her to turn. Then, without a word, he knelt behind her and began to gently comb her hair, slow, careful, patient, not once pulling, not once rushing. When he finished, he wove into feathers, one white, one black, symbol of balance, life and death, pain and peace. Said nothing, but her hands trembled as she held them over her heart. Litter. She asked, have you always lived alone? Tohono stirred the fire. Since my sister was taken. How old was she? 12. Abigail closed her eyes. She didn't need to ask who had taken her, or what had happened. The land itself whispered enough. She leaned toward him, not to comfort, not to fix, just to be close, a silent way of Sanji. See Yoan. The 17th morning they shared coffee brewed from roots and roasted acorns. It was bitter, but good like truth. Tohono handed her a small bag. Inside were seeds, corn, beans, squash. She raised an eyebrow for planting. He nodded. She looked around the wild canyon, the cracked earth, the dry trees. And where do you suppose I'll find a garden? He looked her straight in the eyes. Wherever you decide to stay. She didn't answer, but she didn't give the seeds back either. Then, the next day everything shifted. They were fishing near the creek, quiet, relaxado. Hono bent low, listening to the current. That's when they heard Thor's hooves, distant but steady. Too steady to be wild. Abigail's body stiffened. She grabbed the stone carving from her satchel, the one with the two small figures, held it tight. Hono rose slowly, narrow on the ridge above them. Two riders appeared in it, Apache, not kind white men, clothed in church black coats, rifles slung. They didn't speak, just watched it. Then one of them laughed low, cruel. Abigail recognized that sound. It echoed from a memory. The preacher's son, with man who had left her in the canyon, called her unclean, told the others she ran off on her own, that she was touched in the head, lie that nearly killed her. No, he was back, and she was no longer the girl he thought he'd bury it. Stepped forward, hands trembling, but eyes clear. She didn't yell, didn't scream. She just looked up at them and said quietly, this land doesn't want you. Eli grinned. Well now, Abby, ain't this a strange home for a good Christian girl? Tohono stepped beside her, silence still looming like stone, one hand on his bow, the other open. Ellie's smirk faltered. You really shacked up with this savage? Abigail didn't look away. I chose someone who listens more in a day than you did in 2 years. The other rider muttered something. They turned their horses, rode off, but not before Eli called out over his shoulder, we'll come back. You can count on that. Tohono said nothing. Let's watch the dust rise where the men had vanished. He turned to her and asked, you afraid? She answered without pause, no, not anymore. That night they didn't sleep. They sat by the fire, close, still silent, but something had changed. Not a flicker, but a flame. Tohono held her journal in his hands. She had given it to him unspoken inside. He read her thoughts, her wounds, her wishes. When he looked up she was watching him. He said, you write beautiful pain. She answered, you helped turn it into peace. Then, with all the softness the land could hold, he reached out and touched her cheek, not like a man staking a claim, but like someone checking if the world was real. And for the first time she leaned in it, a kiss, not yet, but the space between them held something ancient, something gentle, something waiting. Morning came, slow, heavy clouds drifting in like a warning whispered through the sky. Tohono watched the ridges every few moments, every shift in wind. New men like that don't ride away forever, especially not when their pride's bruised. Abigail tended the fire, her hands steady, but her eyes kept flicking toward the horizon, where dust might rise. She wasn't afraid anymore, but she was ready, like someone who'd finally stitched her own wounds and knew she wouldn't bleed easy again later. That day they heard it far off, but certain hoofs again, more of them this time. Not 2, not 5, at least 10, and they were coming fast. Tohono didn't speak, he simply moved, handed her the small bag of seeds. Put them in your satchel, he said. She nodded and did. Then he pulled the small water skins from the hut, gave her one, slung the other over his chest. Follow me. They didn't run, not quite, but they moved like deer through brush, quiet, purposeful, knowing when not to be seen. They crossed a narrow stream, climbed a rocky ridge, ducked into a crevice between stone walls so ancient even the wind whispered softer. There, from high above, they could see the canyon mouth, and they saw the Melivan riders' coats, dark guns, polished spurs glinting in the hard morning light at the front. His face sour, not the cruel grin anymore. Now he was angry, embarrassed, looking for something to crush, to prove he still had power. Abigail leaned against the rock, breathing slow, not from fear, but from remembering how she had once asked that man to build her a home, and he'd left her in the wilderness. No, here she was beside someone who hadn't asked her for anything, but had carved her a comb and listened when she cried. They stayed hidden. Hours passed. The riders moved through the canyon, cursing, shouting, firing into the air like children trying to look tall, but they didn't find them. Be dusk, the sky turned the color of rust and rain, and the riders retreated. Deli lingered just a moment, looking around like he could still smell her nearby, then turned and rode after the rest. At night, Tohono made a small fire in the crevice, just enough heat, no light to give them away. Abigail watched the flame, then turned to him. He's not done. Tohono nodded. No. What if he brings more men? He didn't answer for a while, then finally said, then we bring more truth. She smiled at that, a strange, crooked smile, not bitter, just tired. Then she looked up at him. I want to stay. He didn't move. You could go. She continued, deeper into the desert. You know how? I don't, but I want to plant something. I want to try. He finally turned toward her, soft and serious. Then we stay. In the days that followed, they returned to the canyon together, walking slow, careful. They built the fire pit again, repaired the small hut, gathered food, dug a small square of dirt near the water, and she planted the seeds in by one with her own hands. Tohono carved new arrows, laid traps for rabbits, checked the ridge every morning before sun peaked. Abigail built a wind chime from feathers and shells, hung it from the doorway. It sang when the breeze came through, and slowly the place became more than shelter. It became a home. But peace in the West is always borrowed, never owned. And on the 23rd day it came back, smoke not from their fire, but from the other end of the canyon, thicker, dark earth, and a shot cracked through the silence like a lightning whip. Tohono was on his feet in seconds, bow ready, eyes calm. Abigail grabbed her satchel, said nothing, but followed. They crept along the ridge, careful, silent, until they saw the source. Not riders, not at first, just 3 men dragging a wagon through the scrutching to block the creek. Tohono's eyes narrowed. They want to starve the land. Abigail clenched her jaw. That's Eli. It's the same game. He wants to flush us out. They backed away, made a plain, quick quiet. Tohono doubled back, while Abigail took the long route, circling behind the wagon. Men didn't expect trouble. Why would they? She was supposed to be gone, and he was just one man. Be dusk, the fire they'd set on the wagon spread to fast, caught dry scrub, scared the horse. Woe of the men panicked and ran. One fired a shot into the trees, blind. That's when Tohono stepped from the shadows, arrow drawn, silent, astonished. Didn't fire, just stood there. The last man dropped his weapon. Abigail came out from the other side, face covered in ash, eyes wild but unbroken. Fire they started didn't reach the creek, but the smoke drew attention. 3 days later, a small group arrived at Apache, not strangers to Tohono, friends of his mother's blood. They came because he had sent them a signal. A pile of stones, shaped like a sunburst. Old ways still worked. There are moments when a woman knows that the past has caught up. I can smell it in the wind, feel it in the dirt beneath your boots, and see it in the eyes of the man who once left you to die. At dawn, the sky turned copper. A hawk circled above low. Watching waiting Tohono stood at the highest ridge, his bow across his back, his eyes trained on the horizon behind him. Abigail tightened the straps on the mule, not to flee, but to be red-eyed others. 3 elders and 2 young men stood in the canyon below, no guns, just knowing best. The land doesn't choose sides, it only remembers to be mid-morning. The dust rose again, a thunderstorm of hooves, a storm made of men, iron smoke, and ego. 13 this time, Eli at the front, a rifle across his chest. Had Lojaw Lockett come for a show, to end something, and he'd brought the wrong audience as he entered the canyon like they owned it. But the canyon didn't welcome them. Its walls echoed, every hoof beat back twice, loud, a warning disguised. As Perdili shouted, once Abigail, his voice snapped like a whip, desperate to sound strong. She didn't answer. Tohono stepped forward from the ridge above, silhouetted in gold morning light. He froze, then raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a single call rang out, not a gunshot, but the voice of the old Apache woman behind him. She stood with a torch, eyes bright, hair braided with feathers. "You ride into sacred ground," she said, "in search of blood. But blood feeds nothing." The wind caught the flame, carried it to a ring of dry brush below the ridge, and then the ridge lit like a crown of fire, a circle, a boundary, a line they could not cross without burning. Lee's horse panicked, buckled, and whinny at men behind him shifted. One turned his horse around, another looked to Eli, but Eli only stared at the fire, not at the old woman. Abigail stepped forward slowly, deliberately, wore no weapon, just the same long coat he once made her carry, now patched and repaired by Apache hands. Her voice was clear. "You left me with wolves." Eli's face darkened. "You are weak." She shook her head. "No, I was quiet." "There's a difference." He spat in the dirt. "You think this canyon makes you strong." She took one more step forward, closer to the edge of flame. "I was strong the day I chose not to die." The wind shifted, the fire curved, dancing like a spirit. Tohono came to her side, said nothing, just stood there like the earth had risen up behind her. And Eli knew who had already lost it in gunfire, in blood, but in silence and strength and truth. Turned his horse, looked back once, but no one followed his gaze, not even the men behind him, not any more. One by one they turned, rode away, some angry, some confused, some simply relieved it was over. But they left, and the canyon breathed again. Old woman lowered the torch, dropped it into the dust. "To fight fire with fire," she said, "you must first know where to stand." That night they didn't speak much, just sat around the fire. The wind was gentle, the mule slept, the stars came out in slow confession. Abigail sat beside Tohono, their shoulders barely touching. She looked down at the small sprout pushing up from the soil near the fire pit. First seed it had made. It smiled. Weeks passed, and the canyon bloomed with corn, with herbs, with stories, with peace. Abigail wove baskets, painted her door with red earth, sang to the wind chimes each morning. Tohono carved more than arrows now. He carved animal stories, and one day he carved a bird in flight, gave it to her without words, and she took it the same way. An evening, as the sun dropped behind the canyon wall, he reached for her hand, callous, strong, but gentle as river moss. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a welcome. She didn't answer with words, just stood and walked beside him toward the ridge, toward tomorrow. Some say they built a larger home with thick beams and adobe walls, and taught children how to plant seeds in dry earth. Others say they disappeared into the deeper deserts where names didn't matter, only kindness did. But if you listen, when the wind rushes through the canyon and the fire crackles just right, you'll still hear her voice, soft, unshaken. "I was never broken, just waiting." Epilogue spoken like a narrator over cinematic visuals. The camera pulls back, showing the canyon blooming in green. Abigail's carved wind chime sings as it sways. The carved bird sits in her doorway. A sprout grows strong. Tohono watches the sunset beside her. No words, just belonging. Narrator's closing message to the audience, gentle, old soul voice. Sometimes strength don't look like gunfire or fists. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to live again, to stay when it's easier to run, to love without demand, to plant seeds where you were once buried. If this tale touched your heart, friend, leave a comment, let us know where you're watching from, and share this fire with someone who's still finding their way. Until next time, from all of us at Wild West Tales, keep riding toward the light, and remember, the desert remembers the brave.